Picture this. It's the late 70s, the school bell rings for lunch, and you shuffle into that echoey canteen with its plastic trays, clattering cutlery, and the smell of gravy hanging in the air. Whether you loved them, hated them, or just tolerated them, British school dinners were a rite of passage. Some meals were comforting classics, others, well, let's just say they divided the nation. Today, we're taking a trip down memory lane and revisiting 30 amazing British school dinners you completely forgot about. Let's see how many you remember and which ones you secretly miss. Asterisk, we've got to start here, don't we? The mere mention of turkey Twizzlers is enough to spark heated debates. They were the epitome of school dinners in the 90s and early 2000s, slightly mysterious in texture, and coated in that herby seasoning that clung to your fingers. For kids, they were gold. They looked fun, they tasted great, and they were nothing like the boring slabs of meat that usually sat on your tray. You'd dip them in ketchup, wave them around like a toy before eating, and sometimes trade them for a friend's dessert if you were feeling generous. But then came Jamie Oliver. His Feed Me Better campaign painted Twizzlers as the villain. Overprocessed, unhealthy, a symbol of all that was wrong with school food. By the mid-2000s, they were gone. Vanished. For kids who grew up with them, it was like someone had stolen Christmas, and yet, their legacy lives on. They became a symbol of nostalgia, a food so memorable that decades later, supermarkets brought them back in 2020 in a healthier version. But ask anyone who had the originals, and they'll tell you, they'll never be quite the same. Now, here's one that splits the crowd right down the middle. Spam fritters were a hangover from post-war Britain. A thick slice of processed pork, dunked in batter, deep-fried until golden, and slapped on a tray. To some, this was heaven. Crispy, greasy, salty, filling. The kind of food that stuck to your ribs and kept you going all afternoon. Pair it with beans and chips, and you had yourself a Friday feast. To others, pure punishment. The texture could be chewy, the flavor suspiciously mystery meat, and the smell unforgettable. But like so many school dinners, it's not just about the taste, it's about the memory of sitting in the canteen. Your friends daring each other to swap a fritter for pudding, and the ever-present chance of a slightly overcooked one that could chip a tooth. It was divisive, yes, but undeniably iconic. This dish has real history behind it. Born out of wartime rationing, corned beef hash clung onto school menus long after the war ended. It was cheap, it was filling, and it used up leftovers, exactly the kind of thing school kitchens loved. At its best, it was hearty. Mash mixed with corned beef, onions, peas, sometimes a splash of Worcestershire sauce. At its worst, it was a beige lump, slightly greasy, that you pushed around with a fork, hoping a dinner lady wouldn't notice. But it wasn't just food, it was culture. For kids in the 60s and 70s, corned beef hash was as common as rain. It was the taste of thrift, of Britain finding its way after hardship. And whether you loved it or hated it, you remember it. If there's one school dinner that truly deserves the title dependable, it's this. Fish fingers and chips were the meal everyone looked forward to at the end of the week. Golden, crispy fish fingers, sometimes 3 on your plate, if you were lucky. Usually 2 if the dinner lady was strict with a pile of chunky chips. Add peas, beans, or, if you were unlucky, soggy carrots. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't posh, but it was comforting, familiar, and always guaranteed to leave trays completely empty. For many, this was the one meal you'd eat without complaint. The one day you didn't need to trade food with your mates. Now we're into dessert territory, the crown jewel of school dinners. And none are more iconic than pink custard with sponge. The sponge itself was usually plain. Sometimes a little dry, but no one cared. Because what really mattered was the custard. That thick, pastel pink sauce that tasted vaguely of strawberries, but mostly of sugar. No one knows exactly why it was pink. Some say food dye, some say artificial flavoring. Others claim it was just custard with strawberry Nesquik thrown in. But whatever it was, it made dessert magical. You'd drown your sponge in it until you couldn't see the cake at all. Some even drank it on its own, like a milkshake. It wasn't just dessert, it was joy in a jug. Few things say comfort food like this dish. 2 sausages, a dollop of mash, and a ladle of rich onion gravy poured over the top. Sure, the sausages weren't premium, sometimes they were more bread than meat, but in the eyes of hungry kids, they were perfect. The mash was often lumpy, the gravy a bit watery, but when you put it all together, it worked. It was the kind of food that made the school day bearable. The kind of food that reminded you of home, even if it didn't taste quite the same. And on a cold winter's day, it was exactly what you needed. This one doesn't get enough love. Cheese flan, a sort of quiche, but simpler, denser, cheesier. A wedge of it would sit on your tray next to chips or salad, depending on how lucky you were. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't exotic, but it was reliable. Warm, eggy, cheesy, and filling. Sometimes the pastry was a bit soggy, sometimes the top was burnt, but somehow it always got eaten. For vegetarians, it was often the only option on the menu. For everyone else, it was just one of those humble dishes you didn't appreciate until years later. The heavyweight champion of puddings. Jam roly-poly wasn't just a dessert, it was a cultural event. A thick roll of suet pastry filled with jam, sliced into slabs, and drowned in custard. It was dense, heavy, and could probably be used as a building material. But it was glorious. You needed both hands to hold the fork steady, and even then, it felt like a workout to cut through it. But when you did, and the warm jam oozed out into the custard, it was pure heaven. This was a pudding that made the entire lunch hall go quiet for a moment. Respect where respect is due. A fancy name on a school menu always raised eyebrows, and chicken Kiev was the ultimate example. A breaded chicken parcel, crispy on the outside, stuffed with garlic butter inside. The thrill was in the reveal. Would the butter stay inside like a secret treasure, or would it leak out the moment you cut into it? Either way, it felt a bit posh, a bit continental. In reality, they were frozen, mass-produced, and often overcooked. But to school kids, this was dining in style. Here's a divisive one. Semolina pudding was essentially a creamy porridge, made from ground wheat, served hot. Some loved its smooth, comforting texture. Others said it was gloopy wallpaper paste. The saving grace was usually the dollop of jam in the middle. Stir it in, and suddenly, it became a treat. For some, it was nostalgic comfort food. For others, it was the stuff of nightmares. Forget Italian. Authenticity school pizza was its own thing entirely. Thick doughy base, sweet tomato sauce, and cheese that barely melted. They were served in perfect squares, sometimes with random toppings, like sweet corn, or even pineapple. And yet, for all their faults, they were loved. Pizza Day was always a good day. A true retro gem. Sweet, buttery, with a rich caramel-like flavor. This tart was a guaranteed crowd pleaser. It wasn't just dessert, it was an event. The kind of thing kids would line up early for, hoping to get the biggest slice. Paired with custard or cream, it was pure indulgence. A step up from fish fingers, this was a whole fillet, breadcrumbed, and fried. Crispy, flaky, and usually served with chips and peas. It was the grown-up version of fish fingers, though still frozen and reheated. But compared to some of the other options, it was practically gourmet. Yes, the name caused chaos in every school hall. Giggles, jokes, whispered comments. But the pudding itself was no laughing matter. A rich sponge dotted with raisins, soaked in custard. Heavy, filling, and delicious. This was one of those old-school desserts that felt like it belonged in history books, yet somehow ended up on every British child's plate. A true classic. Minced lamb, or often beef, depending on budget, veg and a thick layer of mashed potato baked until golden. Done right, it was warm, comforting, and filling. Done wrong, it was watery mince with instant mash, but either way, it was a fixture of the weekly menu, and you always remember it. The instant pudding of dreams. Just add milk, whisk, and suddenly you had a fluffy, creamy dessert that tasted of pure nostalgia. Artificial, absolutely. Delicious, without a doubt. Angel Delight was the kind of pudding that made kids rush through their main course just to get to it. Cheesy pasta baked in the oven until golden. Simple, comforting, and a lifesaver for vegetarians. Sometimes it was creamy and perfect. Other times it was claggy and dry. But even on its worst day, it was still better than boiled cabbage. Another pudding heavyweight, a golden sponge soaked in syrup, swimming in custard. It was rich, sticky, and guaranteed to put you in a food coma for the rest of the afternoon. But oh, was it worth it? Simplicity at its finest. A fried egg, a pile of chips, maybe some beans. That's it. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, cheap, and comforting. Sometimes the egg yolk was runny perfection, sometimes it was overcooked rubber. Either way, you ate it. Now this is the dessert that deserves a national revival. A pastry, base, a layer of golden syrup, topped with crunchy cornflakes. Served hot with custard. It was the perfect combination of sweet, sticky, and crunchy. The kind of pudding people still dream about years later. The beefy cousin of shepherd's pie. Minced beef, veg, and mashed potato topping. Like its sibling, it could be comforting and hearty, or watery and bland. But it was always filling, always reliable, and always memorable. We end on another divisive dish, creamy rice cooked in milk, often sprinkled with nutmeg. Sometimes it had a dollop of jam in the middle, which made all the difference. For some, it was nostalgia in a bowl. For others, it was glue with sugar. But one thing's for sure, it's unforgettable. Beans on toast wasn't just food, it was a cultural staple, the kind of meal that summed up British practicality in one neat portion. Cheap, cheerful, filling, and just about healthy enough to pass school standards. At school, it was sometimes served as a main when budgets were tight, and sometimes as a side dish alongside things like sausage or pie. The beans would come in a huge silver vat, ladled out onto slices of toast that were often more soggy than crispy by the time they hit your tray. But that didn't matter. It was warm, it was comforting, and it was exactly what you needed after. Double maths. And here's the funny thing. At home, beans on toast might have felt boring, but in the school canteen, with friends all around, it became part of the ritual. Some kids would carefully balance the beans on the toast to stop them dripping, while others would mash everything into one big pile and shovel it down. Or not, it's one of the most quintessentially British dishes that ever graced a school dinner tray. Now, not every school offered this one, but those that did, you'll never forget it. Lancashire hot pot was a hearty stew of lamb or beef with onions, carrots, and other veg, topped with thin slices of potato baked until crisp on top. It was a dish with roots in working-class Britain, especially in the north. For generations, it was the kind of food families made at home to stretch ingredients and fill hungry stomachs. So when it appeared on the school menu, it felt proper. The thing about hot pot was that it was the meat would be tender, the gravy rich, the potatoes slightly crunchy on the edges. At least, that was the idea. Sometimes in schools, the potatoes ended up a bit soggy. The meat chewy, but even then it was still a cut above most dinners. If you grew up with Lancashire hot pot at school, you remember it as one of the rare days when lunch actually felt like a treat. Not just fuel. Now here's one for the sweet tooth. Angel cake slices were instantly recognizable. Soft sponge in pink, yellow, and white stripes. Layered neatly with a thin cream or icing in between. Sometimes they were shop-bought, sometimes baked in the school kitchen. But either way, they brightened up any tray. Kids loved them because they looked fun, like something out of a birthday party. And let's be honest, school desserts didn't always look exciting. But angel cake. It was colorful, it was cheerful, and it tasted like simple sugary bliss. The sponge itself was light and soft. Sometimes a little dry, but paired with the sweet filling, it was exactly what you wanted after a savory meal. And the best part, they were easy to share or trade with friends. Half an angel cake slice for a spoonful of custard. Deal done. This was the kind of dessert that required both skill and bravery. Skill to actually eat it without making a mess, and bravery because you knew half of it was going to end up down your school jumper. Custard cream slices were made with layers of flaky pastry and thick custard sandwiched in between. The problem? The moment you pressed your fork into it, the custard squished out the sides, The pastry crumbled. And suddenly your tray looked like a battlefield. But oh, was it worth it? The custard was sweet and creamy, the pastry buttery and crisp. It was indulgent in a way school desserts rarely were. Even the mess was part of the fun. You'd laugh with friends about who made the biggest disaster on their tray. It was chaotic, it was impractical, and it was unforgettable. Everyone remembers apple crumble. It's one of the kings of school puddings. But toffee apple crumble, that was next level. This twist on the classic took soft, sweet apples and baked them with a sticky toffee sauce, then topped the whole lot with golden, crunchy crumble. The result was pure heaven. Warm, gooey, crunchy, and sweet all at once. Served piping hot with custard, it was one of those desserts that made the entire lunch queue cheer when they spotted it on the menu board. You knew it was going to be a good day. The toffee flavor gave it something special, richer, sweeter, a little bit cheeky compared to plain apple. It was the kind of dessert kids would remember years later as one of the highlights of their school dining days. This one might not sound exciting, but it was one of the most comforting dishes schools ever served. Cheese and potato pie was cheap, filling, and exactly what growing kids needed in the middle of the day. It was basically layers of mashed potato mixed with cheese, sometimes with onion, baked until the top went golden. The result was warm, creamy, and satisfying. Sure, it wasn't gourmet, but it was hearty. Pair it with beans or peas, and you had a meal that actually stuck with you. For vegetarians, this was often the star of the show, one of the few meat-free options on rotation. For everyone else, it was just pure comfort. The kind of food you didn't appreciate at the time, but later in life, you suddenly remember with a smile. Now this was a proper treat. Vanilla ice cream wrapped in a layer of sponge with jam. It came frozen solid, sliced neatly, and placed on your tray. Arctic roll felt special because it was so different from the usual hot puddings. Most school desserts were heavy, stodgy, and drowned in custard. But Arctic roll, it was cool, refreshing, and, dare we say, a little bit posh, of course. Sometimes it was so frozen solid that you could barely get your spoon through it. You'd chip away at the edges like an archaeologist uncovering treasure. But once you got a bite, it was worth it. The creamy ice cream, the soft sponge, the sweet jam. A perfect combination. Arctic roll days didn't come often, but when they did, everyone remembered. We've saved the most iconic for last. Chocolate concrete wasn't just a pudding, it was a legend. A slab of chocolate cake, so hard, you practically needed a hammer and chisel to break it. Kids joked you could use it as a weapon or a hockey puck. And yet, despite its toughness, once you got through that outer shell, it was sweet chocolatey and oddly satisfying. But what really made it special was the mint custard. Yes, mint. That bright green, slightly toothpaste-flavored custard that somehow paired perfectly with the dense slab of chocolate concrete. It looked bizarre, it tasted unique, and it was utterly unforgettable. Ask anyone who went to a British school in the 80s or 90s, and they'll tell you, chocolate concrete with mint custard was the king of puddings. The one that united everyone in both frustration, why is it so hard, and delight. It was the perfect end to a school dinner. Chaotic, colorful, and iconic. So there you have it, 230 amazing British school dinners you probably forgot about. From the pink custards to the concrete puddings, from the comforting pies to the divisive spam fritters, these meals defined generations of British childhoods. They weren't perfect, but they were unforgettable. Which of these do you remember most? Which ones would you love to try again, and which would you happily leave in the past? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more nostalgic trips back through British life.